Hey guys, tonight we follow the most extraordinary, terrifying, and frankly improbable life in all of human history. A boy born in a felt tent on the frozen steppe, who had nothing, not a horse, not a friend, not a name anyone feared. A boy abandoned, enslaved, and left for dead. And yet somehow, this same boy would go on to conquer more land than any single person who ever lived. More than Alexander, more than Caesar, more than Napoleon. Tonight, we are talking about Temujin, the man the world would come to know as Genghis Khan. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together, because this is not a story about a man born into greatness. There are no palaces here, no silver spoons, no proud dynasty waiting to hand him a crown. This is the story of a child born into a world that wanted him dead, a world of wind and cold and blood feuds and betrayal. And yet from that brutal starting point, he built the largest contiguous empire in recorded history. Over 24 million square kilometers, more than a fifth of the entire land surface of the Earth. Consider what that number actually means. The entire continent of Europe is roughly 10 million square kilometers. The continental United States is about 8 million. The Roman Empire at its height was around 5 million. The Empire of Alexander the Great, often held up as the gold standard of ancient conquest, reached about 5.2 million. Genghis Khan and his immediate successors built something that was, in territorial terms, simply in a different category from everything that had come before it. They did not just push the boundaries of what an empire could be, they redrew them so completely that the old map became meaningless, and he started with a blood clot in his fist and nothing else. So pull up a chair, because the life of Genghis Khan begins not with triumph, but with a dark and freezing night on a Mongolian plain, and it doesn't let up for one single moment after that. Chapter 1. The Boy Born, Clutching Blood. The year is approximately 1162. Historians argue over the exact date with the kind of passion that suggests it matters deeply to them, and barely at all to the man himself. What we know is this. Somewhere in the wild rolling grasslands of northeastern Mongolia, near a river called the Onon, a woman named Hoelun gave birth to a child. His name was Temujin, and he came into the world clutching something in his tiny fist. A blood clot, dark, hard, the size of a knuckle. In Mongolian folklore, this was taken as a sign, not just a sign, an omen. A boy who arrives already holding blood in his hand is a boy who was born for war. His father, Yasuge, was a minor chieftain of the Borte clan, which sounds impressive until you understand that the Mongolian steppe in the 12th century was covered in minor chieftains, each one ruling over a few hundred people, a few hundred horses, and roughly 10 years of grudges. Yasuge was well connected enough to have enemies, which in the steppe world meant he was doing moderately well. He was coming home from a raid on a rival tribe called the Tatars when Temujin was born, and, in an act that seems either deeply poetic or deeply irresponsible depending on your perspective, he named his newborn son after a Tatar warrior he had just captured, because nothing says welcome to the world like being named after your father's prisoner. Life on the Mongolian steppe in the 12th century was not something you survived by being soft. You lived in a jur, a circular felt tent that could be packed up and moved in an hour. You ate what you could find: horse meat, mutton, dried, curds, marmot if you were lucky and desperate. You drank fermented mare's milk called airag, which was alcoholic, slightly sour, and the closest thing the steppe had to a sports drink. The winters were savage, The winds came across flat open country with nothing to slow them down. Temperatures dropped so far below freezing that rivers turned to highways, and the breath from your horse's nostrils froze before it hit the air. You learned to ride before you learned to write. You learned to shoot a bow before you learned to read. And you understood from the very beginning of your consciousness that the world was a place of alliances and betrayals, of raids and reprisals, and of short, brutal lives lived under an enormous sky. Temujin had 3 brothers, Kasar, Kajun, and Temuge. He had a younger sister named Temulun. He also had 2 older half-brothers from his father's other wife, a woman who had been taken by Yasuge. Her name was Soshigal, and her sons were named Bekter and Belgute. Already, even as a small child, the world Temujin inhabited was threaded through with the kind of family complexity that would make a later storyteller rub their hands together with glee, and everyone actually living it terrified. When Temujin was around 9 years old, his father made a decision that would change everything. It was time to find the boy a wife. Not because Temujin was old enough to marry, he wasn't, but because betrothal negotiations happened early on the steppe. Yasuge took his son on horseback to visit a clan called the Ongirat, who were known for producing beautiful daughters, and sure enough, Yasuge found exactly what he was looking for. A girl named Borte, about the same age as Temujin, with dark eyes and the kind of composure that suggested she had already seen enough of life to know not to be surprised by it. Her father agreed to the match. Temujin was left behind in the Ongirat camp, according to custom, to serve as a future son-in-law and earn his bride. He would work in their household, learn their ways, and eventually, when both parties were old enough, return to claim his wife. Yasuge rode home alone, and on the way he made the single worst decision of his short life. He stopped to eat with a group of Tatars. The Tatars, remember, were the same people Yasuge had raided years before, the people he had named his son after, the people who had excellent reasons to hate him. Being a guest meant something sacred on the steppe. You did not harm a man who ate at your fire, in theory. In practice, the Tatars recognized Yasuge, smiled and served him food that had been very carefully prepared to ensure he would not make it home. Yasuge managed to ride several days before the poison took hold. He sent for Temujin. By the time his 9-year-old son arrived, Yasuge the Brave, minor chieftain of the Borte clan, was dead. And just like that, the boy who had arrived clutching a blood clot found himself clutching nothing at all. Chapter 2. Abandoned, Enslaved, and Alone. Here is where lesser stories end, and the story of Genghis Khan truly begins. Because what happened to Temujin after his father's death was not just tragic. It was a series of abandonments and humiliations so complete, so thorough, so systematic, that they should have destroyed him entirely. Instead, they built him. After Yasuge died, the clan did what clans on the steppe did when a chieftain left behind a widow, young children, and no powerful allies. They left. The other families, the ones who had followed Yasuge and eaten his food and benefited from his protection, looked at Hoelun and her brood of small children and decided that loyalty was a luxury for people with options. They abandoned them, took the animals, the supplies, the strong young men, and rode away into the steppe. Left behind were Hoelun and her 5 children, a handful of elderly relatives too frail to be worth taking, and whatever scraps the departing families had not bothered to steal. Temujin was 9 years old. His brothers were younger. Winter was coming. What followed was years of survival so brutal it barely seems real. Hoelun, who had been taken from another man before she married Yasuge, and had known a life of displacement from the beginning, was not a woman who surrendered. She fed her children on roots, berries, wild garlic, pine nuts, and whatever small animals could be caught along the riverbanks. She dried meat in the sun. She foraged with the ferocious determination of a woman who understood that no one was coming to help her. The children learned to fish, to snare small animals, to live on almost nothing. But survival was only the beginning of Temujin's problems. The two older half-brothers, Bekta and Belgute, children of the other wife, competed viciously with Temujin and Kasar for what little food existed. Bekta was older, bigger, and had decided that his position in the family hierarchy demanded that he take the best of everything. Fish that Temujin caught, birds that Kasar snared, gone, taken, and there was nothing the younger boys could do about it. Nothing, that is, until one day when Temujin and Kasar did something that has haunted historians and biographers ever since. They crept up on Bekta while he sat alone on a hillside watching the horses, and they shot him with arrows, their own half-brother. Temujin was somewhere between 9 and 13 years old, depending on which account you trust. His mother screamed at them when she found out, comparing them to animals, invoking the names of ancient destroyers. The secret history of the Mongols, the earliest written account of Temujin's life, records this moment with uncomfortable directness. It doesn't excuse it. It doesn't explain it. It simply tells us it happened. What it tells us about Temujin is something that every ruler and enemy and ally of his future would eventually learn. When he decided someone was a threat to his survival, he acted completely, without hesitation, with no tolerance for the kind of half-measures that left threats alive to return later. But before Temujin could build anything, the world delivered another blow. A rival clan called the Taichigud, who had once been loosely allied with Yasuge, decided that the son of a dead chieftain was exactly the kind of dangerous future problem that should be dealt with now. They raided the family's camp, scattered the horses, and took Temujin prisoner. He was put in a wooden kangwe, a heavy yoke locked around his neck that prevented him from sleeping properly, eating properly, or moving without assistance. He was passed between Taichigud families, made to work, made to serve, made to feel the full weight of his complete powerlessness. He was a slave, a boy who had been born clutching a blood clot, who had watched his father die, who had survived winters on roots and river fish, was now wearing a wooden collar and sleeping on a stranger's floor. He was a teenager. He was completely alone. He had nothing. But here is the thing about Temujin, that every captor, every rival, every enemy from this point forward would eventually learn the hard way. He was not someone who stayed in a situation he could escape from, and he was not someone who, once free, forgot what had put him in chains. While in captivity, he moved between households, worked when made to work, and watched everything. He watched the way the Taichigud organized themselves. He watched their guard rotations. He watched their horses. He memorized faces and names and grievances the way a bookkeeper memorizes accounts, because he understood even then, young as he was, that information was its own kind of weapon, and that the moment would come when all of it would be useful. He escaped. He was helped by a sympathetic family, the Sorkan Shira family, whose son Chilon hid him in a cartload of wool when the Taichigud came searching. He fled into the night, navigating by the pole star across open steppe. He found his family. He came back, and he remembered everyone who had helped him, and everyone who had not. Chapter 3. The marriage that started everything Borte had waited through the years of chaos after Yasuge's death, through the abandonment and the slavery and the scraping survival. The betrothal made when Temujin was 9 years old had remained technically intact. The Ongirat clan had held onto their promise. And now, as Temujin emerged from his ordeal and began the slow process of rebuilding, he went back to claim his bride. She was worth claiming. Borte was not a passive figure in Temujin's story. She was sharp, politically aware, and brought with her something that mattered enormously in the world of the steppe. Her family gave her a magnificent wedding gift, a sable fur coat, dark, glossy, extraordinarily valuable, and Temujin, immediately understanding that survival on the steppe required allies before it required anything else, took that coat and rode with it to visit Togrul Khan, the powerful leader of a neighbouring tribe called the Keraites. Togrul Khan had once been friends with Yasuge. He had called Yasuge his sworn brother, his Anda. Temujin now presented himself as the son of that sworn brother, offered the sable coat as a gift, and asked for Togrul's protection and alliance. Togrul, impressed by the young man's directness, and perhaps by the quality of the coat, agreed. In one move, the homeless, resourceless son of a dead minor chieftain had attached himself to one of the most powerful men on the steppe. But the world had more disasters prepared. A few months after the wedding, while Temujin was away visiting allies, a raiding party of Merkits arrived. The Merkits had their own ancient grievance with the Borte clan. Decades earlier, Yasuge had stolen Hurlan from a Merkit man during an ambush on the road. The Merkits remembered. They came in numbers, in the night, sweeping down on the camp so fast that there was barely time to run. Hurlan and most of the family escaped into the forest on horseback, but Borte did not make it. She was taken, captured, carried off by the Merkits as a kind of long-delayed repayment for the woman Yasuge had taken a generation before. For most men on the steppe, losing a wife to a raid was a tragedy but not a catastrophe. Wives could be replaced. But Temujin was not most men. He refused to accept it. He went to Togrul Khan, invoked their alliance, gathered warriors, and launched a rescue operation with a speed and determination that no one who knew him would ever forget. They found the Merkit camp. They attacked in the night. In the chaos and darkness, voices called out to each other across the confusion. Borte heard Temujin's voice. She ran toward it. They found each other in the dark, and Temujin held his wife as if the world had tried to take everything from him, because it had, and he had gone, out, and taken it back. But there was a complication. Borte was pregnant when she was rescued, and her first son, Yochi, was born just months later. Temujin acknowledged Jochi as his son. He raised him. He loved him. But the question of Jochi's paternity cast a shadow over the boy's entire life, and would eventually fracture the empire itself. In every story about the founding of the Mongol nation, this moment sits like a splinter under the skin, never quite acknowledged, never quite resolved. And yet what the rescue of Borte tells us about Temujin is more than just the story of a husband getting his wife back. It tells us that he understood alliance. He understood how to invoke obligation without appearing to beg for it. He went to Togrul Khan not as a desperate man begging for charity, but as the son of a sworn brother calling in a debt of loyalty. The framing was everything. Togrul responded not out of pity, but out of honour, and honour was a currency that could be spent and respent on the steppe as long as you managed it carefully. He also, in this campaign, began to understand the value of combined arms. The Merkit were destroyed not in a single dramatic clash, but through coordination, encirclement, and speed. The tactics were early. They were rough, but the principles were the same ones he would refine over the next 4 decades into something that would bring civilizations to their knees. Find your enemy's weakness, hit it where they cannot respond, divide them before they can concentrate, leave no way out except the way you decide to leave open. The rescue was a campaign, a small one, a practice run. The universal ruler was just beginning to discover what he was capable of. Chapter 4. The Art of Making Brothers and Enemies. Before Temujin was a conqueror, he was a politician. Before he was a warlord, he was an alliance builder. And the tools he used were not only horses and arrows. He used friendship, loyalty, and an almost uncanny ability to identify which men would be useful and which men would eventually need to be dealt with. The steppe political world into which he was growing was not a place where even sacred oaths were simple. The Mongolian tribes in the 12th century existed in a constant state of fluid alliance and shifting power, where a clan that was your ally in one season might be your enemy in the next, where marriages created connections and raids destroyed them with equal ease, where the fundamental currency of power was not land or gold, but people, warriors who followed you, horses that mounted your armies, women who bore the next generation of fighters. The leader who could attract followers was powerful. The leader who could hold them through adversity was rarer and more dangerous. What Temujin had that most other young chieftains on the steppe did not was a quality that is extremely difficult to fake over time. He made the people around him feel that their loyalty to him was not merely transactional, that they were part of something that mattered. His first sworn friend Borte came to him as a teenager when Temujin's horses were stolen. Borte simply helped him recover them, without payment, without condition, because something in Temujin made Borte want to be the kind of person who helped him. He stayed for the rest of his life. The most important friendship of Temujin's early life was with a man named Jamuka. They had been childhood friends, and in the way of the Mongolian steppe, they had formally sworn brotherhood to each other, exchanging gifts and making themselves anda, sworn brothers. In Mongol culture, this was a bond considered equal to, or even stronger than blood. You did not betray your anda. You were bound together by oaths as solid as the frozen earth. After the rescue of Borte, Temujin and Jamuka rode together for over a year and a half, their combined camps moving across the steppe as one unit. Warriors were drawn to both of them, for different reasons. Jamuka was brilliant, charismatic, born into a more established clan and deeply traditional in his understanding of the steppe hierarchy. He believed that the old ways, where aristocratic lineage determined rank, where the nobly born commanded and the common people followed, were the correct ways. He was the kind of leader who inspired awe and demanded loyalty from a position of inherited authority. Temujin was something different. He rewarded loyalty rather than birth. He distributed plunder equally among those who earned it. He promoted capable men regardless of their clan background. A skilled soldier from a nobody family could rise in Temujin's service. A useless man from a great family could find himself looking for a new employer. This was quietly revolutionary, and the steppe's common warriors noticed. They began drifting toward Temujin's camp with a consistency that Jamuka watched and said nothing about for longer than perhaps he should have. One morning, after a night of camping, Jamuka made a suggestion about where the two camps should separate and set up for the day. It sounded like practical advice about grazing land. Borte told Temujin that it wasn't. She told him it was a coded signal that the time of joint travel was over, that Jamuka was indicating the split was here. Whether Borte was right, or whether she read political meaning into innocent logistics, Temujin took her counsel. The two sworn brothers separated. They would not ride together as allies again. They would eventually stand on opposite sides of every single battle that mattered. In the years that followed the split, Temujin's reputation grew with the methodical certainty of water-carving stone. He gathered warriors. He made alliances with powerful chieftains. He was formally recognized by Genghis Khan as a kind of junior partner in a powerful confederation, and he began doing something that no one on the Mongolian steppe had done in a very long time, perhaps ever. He was trying to unite the tribes, not just conquer them, not just defeat them in battle and take their horses and ride away. Unite them, make them one people. under one authority, with one law. The idea was so foreign to how the steppe had always worked that many of the people he proposed it to probably smiled politely and assumed he had been out in the cold too long. He was not wrong about what he was doing. He was just very, very early. Chapter 5. The Rise, the Betrayals, and the Price of Greatness. The path from ambitious chieftain to supreme ruler of the Mongols was not a clean upward line. It was a decade of brutal wars, betrayals, near annihilations, and hard-won lessons about which people could be trusted, and which people, no matter how many oaths they swore, would sell you to your enemies the moment the price was right. The first great crisis came from the Tatars, the same people who had poisoned Temujin's father. The Jin dynasty of northern China, a powerful empire that had learned long ago that the best way to keep the Mongolian tribes from uniting was to encourage them to fight each other, paid the Tatars to raid the Karaite Confederation. Togrul and Temujin rode together to defeat the Tatars, and the Jin rewarded them for doing their dirty work. Temujin was given a title, Wang Khan, essentially loyal ruler. It meant nothing to the Jin Empire, which expected their new loyal ruler to stay small and manageable. It meant everything to the Mongols, who saw the recognition as legitimacy. Then came the betrayals, stacked one on top of another like an architectural experiment in how much a man can endure. First, a coalition of 11 rival chieftains, sensing Temujin's growing power, united against him under the leadership of Jamukha. They called themselves the 13 Wings. They came in force. They pushed Temujin back hard, forced him to retreat into a narrow valley, and the battle was close enough that survival was not guaranteed. Temujin held, barely, but he held. And when the coalition fractured afterward, as coalitions always do when the shared enemy fails to be conveniently destroyed, he remembered every face that had been on that field. Then Togrul Khan, his oldest and most powerful ally, the man he had called father and served faithfully for years, made the worst decision of his life. His son, Sengum, convinced the old Khan that Temujin had grown too powerful, that the student was about to surpass the teacher, that if they did not act now, there would be no acting later. Togrul agreed. They invited Temujin to a peace conference and prepared an ambush. Temujin was warned just barely and fled before the trap closed. The betrayal by the man he had called father hit harder than most. Not because Temujin was naive. He hadn't been naive since he was 9 years old, but because he had given real loyalty to Togrul and received a knife in the back for it. He retreated to a place called Baljuna, a muddy lake in the middle of nowhere with only 19 followers, 19 men. Out of everything he had built, everything he had assembled, 19 remained. He drank the muddy water of Baljuna and swore an oath with those 19 men. The Baljuna Covenant, it's sometimes called. He promised them that if he rose again, they would share everything with him. And they drank together from that muddy lake and pledged to stand with him, whatever came next. What came next was one of the most spectacular comebacks in political history. Temujin gathered warriors with quiet, furious efficiency. He found generals, he found alliances, he reassembled an army, and then he turned on Togrul Khan with everything he had. The Karaites were destroyed. Togrul fled into Naiman territory, where he was killed by strangers who didn't know or care who he was. And just like that, the most powerful man on the steppe was gone, and the empty space where his power had been was filled by the only man still standing. Jamukha was last. He had been Temujin's sworn brother, his Anda. They had exchanged gifts as children and sworn oaths under the sky. Now Jamukha was running out of options, out of tribes, out of allies. One by one, the chieftains who had followed him understood which way the wind was blowing. Some surrendered. Others fled. and Jamukha's own followers in the end captured him and brought him to Temujin, hoping to earn favor. Temujin had Jamukha's followers executed, not Jamukha, his Anda. He offered Jamukha reconciliation. He called him his sworn brother and asked him to return to the friendship they had shared as young men. He meant it, probably. Jamukha refused. He told Temujin that there was not room in the sky for two sons. He asked only for a noble death, a death without bloodshed, which on the steppe was the gift given to people of high status. Temujin gave it to him. The details of exactly how are unclear, deliberately so, but Jamukha died without the indignity of having his blood touch the ground. The last rival was gone. The steppe was quiet for the first time in living memory, and Temujin called a great gathering of all the Mongol tribes. But before that gathering, it is worth sitting with what the Baljuna covenant actually meant. 19 men, some of them Mongols, but not all. Among the 19 were men of different faiths, different clans, different origins. A Muslim merchant named Hassan had been with them. Khitan and Jurchen men had been there. They had drunk from the same muddy water and shared the same oath in a moment of absolute vulnerability and absolute honesty. There was nothing to perform. There was no audience to impress. There was just a man who had lost everything and the handful of people who had chosen, for their own reasons, to stay with him anyway. It is not a coincidence that the policies Genghis Khan would later establish, the religious tolerance, the promotion of men regardless of their ethnic or clan background, the idea that loyalty to the great Khan superseded loyalty to any tribe or faith, mirror the composition of the men who drank muddy water with him at Baljuna. He had learned what worked by living it. He had learned that a Muslim merchant and a Khitan warrior and a Mongol tribesman could all pledge loyalty to the same man and hold that pledge, because he had seen it happen, not in theory, in the worst conditions imaginable. The empire he built was seeded at Baljuna, not in the grand moments of conquest, in the mud. He also, in the years between the split from Jamukha and the final unification, had to navigate a lesson that most powerful men learn too late or not at all. He had to learn to lose, not gracefully, not philosophically, but practically. He had to lose battles, absorb the reality of defeat, and use the information to become better. The 13 Wings campaign, where Jamukha's coalition pushed him back hard, was a setback that could have broken a less resilient man. Instead, he studied it. He looked at what had failed and why. He made adjustments. Defeats shape the victories in ways that the victories alone could never have managed. Chapter 6. The Birth of Genghis Khan. In 1206, in a place called the Onon River headwaters, the same river where Temujin had been born roughly 40 years before, the tribes assembled. A great white standard was raised. 9 yak tails flew from a pole, the traditional symbol of supreme authority, and an elderly shaman named Kokochu, who claimed to have ridden to heaven on his spirit horse and received messages from Tengri, the sky god, declared to the assembled people what all of them already knew in their bones. Temujin was given a new name, Genghis Khan. The meaning is debated by scholars to this day. The most widely accepted translation is universal ruler, or ruler of all. Some argue for fierce ruler. Some say the word Genghis relates to oceanic vastness, a ruler as wide and unlimited as the sea. Whatever the precise linguistic root, the meaning was unmistakable. This was not a claim to rule the Mongols. This was a claim to rule the world. He was not being modest. At this great assembly, he reorganized everything. The old tribal structure, the one that had kept the Mongols fragmented and feuding for centuries, was dismantled and rebuilt. His army was organized into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 men. Each unit had a commander. Commanders were chosen for ability, not bloodline. A man who could not lead was replaced. A man who could lead was rewarded beyond anything the old system had ever offered. This sounds like common sense. On the 12th century steppe, it was a revolution. He created the yasa, a code of law. Formally orally transmitted, it governed everything. Murder, theft, adultery, the rules of war, the treatment of conquered peoples, the obligations of soldiers, the duties of commanders. No one was above it. Not his sons, not his generals, not himself, at least in theory. Disputes that had previously been settled by blood feud and endless cycle of reprisal now had a legal framework. This was staggering. These were people whose entire cultural identity was built around clan loyalty and personal vengeance. And here was a man telling them that the law was bigger than the clan. He also established religious tolerance as formal policy. In a medieval world drowning in holy wars and religious persecution, Genghis Khan explicitly protected the right of his subjects to practice whatever religion they chose. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, shamanists, all were free to worship. Clergy of all faiths were exempt from taxation. He was not a saint, and this was not charity. It was strategic. A conquered people who were allowed to keep their religion were far less likely to rise in rebellion than people whose temples had been burned and whose priests had been executed. But, whatever the motivation, the policy was genuinely unusual for its time. He elevated literacy. He adopted the Uyghur script for the Mongolian language, creating a writing system that had not previously existed. A nomadic people who had passed their history entirely by oral tradition suddenly had written law, written records, written correspondence. The empire had a bureaucracy, a functioning, literate bureaucracy, on the steppe. Genghis Khan was 50 years old, approximately, and he was just getting started. What is often missed in the broad sweep of his military reputation is how deeply administrative his genius was. The Yasa was not a simple tribal code. It addressed commerce, setting standards for weights and measures and the treatment of travelling merchants. It addressed the military, with rewards for bravery and strict consequences for abandoning a comrade in battle. It addressed personal conduct, prohibiting washing in running water, a pragmatic measure in a culture that camped near rivers that were everyone's water supply, and establishing protocols for the slaughter of animals that reduced waste. It established that spies who reported false information would be executed, that soldiers who abandoned their unit in battle would be executed, that officers who did not support each other would face consequences. These were not arbitrary cruelties. They were the architecture of an institution. Genghis Khan was building something that could outlast any individual battle, any individual campaign, any individual man, including himself. The postal relay system he established, called the YAM, was another engineering marvel of administration. Relay stations spaced approximately 25 miles apart across the entire empire, each stocked with fresh horses, food and shelter. Official messengers could cover 200 miles a day. Information and orders moved across the empire at speeds that no other state could match. In an era when the speed of communication was the speed of a horse, the Mongols had created something close to a telegraph network. He also took an approach to conquered peoples that was, by the standards of the time, unusual in its pragmatism. The traditional approach to conquest in the ancient and medieval world was simple. Take the wealth, enslave or kill the population, install your own people in positions of authority, and move on. Genghis Khan understood that this model was wasteful. A dead artisan made no saddles. A burned city generated no revenue. A devastated agricultural region fed no one. The destruction that accompanied Mongol conquest was real and catastrophic, but it was not the end goal. The end goal was a functioning, productive empire, and functioning, productive empires required the expertise of the people who had built them. He kept Chinese administrators administering. He kept Persian bureaucrats bureaucrating. He kept Uyghur scribes scribing. He put Mongols on top of existing structures where it mattered, and left the existing structures otherwise more or less intact. This was not mercy, it was efficiency, but the effects were not entirely different from mercy, in many cases, for many people. Chapter 7. The war machine that changed the world. Before Genghis Khan, the Mongols were fearsome raiders. After Genghis Khan, they were something the world had never encountered before. An army so sophisticated, so disciplined, so tactically innovative, that every military theorist for the next 8 centuries would be measuring themselves against it. The Mongol warrior was, from early childhood, an extraordinary soldier. He was raised on horseback, sometimes literally placed in a saddle before he could walk. He learned to shoot a composite bow at full gallop, hitting targets at distances that seemed physically impossible to the infantry armies he would one day face. The composite bow itself was a masterpiece of engineering, made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, with a draw weight that required years of development to handle, and a range that exceeded almost every other bow in the medieval world. A Mongol archer could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute. He could do this at a full gallop. He could do it while feigning retreat. He could do it while the enemy thought they were winning. The feigned retreat was perhaps the most devastatingly effective tactic in the Mongol arsenal. Disciplined armies who had learned through experience that a routing enemy was a defeated enemy would pursue fleeing Mongol cavalry with enthusiasm, only to find that the Mongols had been running on purpose, drawing the pursuing force into a killing ground where encircling cavalry and archers were waiting. It was a trap that worked with the relentless frequency of a piece of machinery. It worked on people who knew about it. It worked on people who had been warned about it. It worked because the Mongols executed it with a discipline and coordination that was nearly impossible to counter, even when you saw it coming. Part of the reason it kept working, even against opponents who knew about it intellectually, is that it exploited something deep and consistent in human nature. When you see an enemy running from you, something in the brain reads it as victory and urges pursuit. Keeping disciplined formations in the face of fleeing enemies requires a kind of trained restraint that most medieval armies simply did not practice. The Mongols had trained for the feigned retreat the way they had trained for everything else, relentlessly, from childhood, until it was reflex rather than decision. Genghis Khan also understood psychological warfare in a way that was quite modern. The terror reputation of his armies was not an unfortunate side effect of conquest. It was deliberate policy. Cities that surrendered without a fight were treated generously. Cities that resisted and were taken were made examples so complete, so thorough, so publicized through the deliberate release of survivors who carried the stories with them, that the next city down the road was calculating the mathematics of resistance before a single arrow was fired. In this way, the actual violence of the Mongol armies was amplified into a deterrent force many times larger than the physical army itself. Ambassadors and envoys were treated with absolute protection when they came in good faith. When they were harmed, as in the case of the Khwarezmian merchants and the subsequent ambassadors, the response was calibrated to be so overwhelming that no future ruler would make the same calculation. This was consistent policy. Not rage, not revenge in any purely emotional sense. Demonstration, warning, message. You killed my ambassador. I will not let this create ambiguity about what happens next. The communications network also served military intelligence. Genghis Khan's generals coordinated movements across vast distances with a precision that their enemies found bewildering. Columns that appeared to be moving independently would suddenly converge on a single point, with a timing that suggested either supernatural coordination or very good messengers. It was the messengers. The Yam system was as much a military tool as an administrative one, and the information that flowed along it before and during campaigns gave Mongol commanders a situational awareness that their opponents simply lacked. Genghis Khan was also, by all historical evidence, a genuine military genius in terms of incorporating new technologies and techniques. When he encountered siege warfare, a discipline in which the nomadic Mongols had no traditional expertise, he solved the problem the same way he solved every problem. He found the best people in the world at it and hired them. Chinese engineers, Persian engineers, captured specialists from every civilization he encountered. Within a remarkably short period, the Mongol armies that had seemed limited by their inability to reduce fortified cities became some of the most formidable siege operators on Earth. He also understood intelligence and information with a clarity that would not be fully appreciated by most military establishments until centuries later. He deployed an extensive network of scouts, spies, and informants before every campaign. He knew the routes, the water sources, the defensive capabilities, the internal politics, and the morale of his enemies before the first horse crossed into their territory. He sent ambassadors ahead, partly to gather information, partly to offer terms. And he genuinely meant the terms. If a city submitted peacefully, its people were spared, its skilled workers were absorbed, its administrators were often kept in their jobs. If a city resisted and was taken by force, the consequences were made so catastrophic and so well publicized that the next city on the route was considerably more likely to open its gates voluntarily. This was information warfare in the 13th century, 1,000 years before anyone coined the term. The speed of Mongol movement was also something that contemporary military thinking simply could not accommodate. An army that carried everything on horseback, that required no supply train of wagons and oxen, that could move across terrain that other armies considered impassable, that could cover distances in a week that would take a European army a month, was not an army that played by the rules anyone else had written. Commanders who prepared their defences based on how long they expected it to take the Mongols to arrive frequently found themselves preparing for an army that was already there. Chapter 8. The Conquest of the Seer and the Jin. The first great campaigns beyond the Mongolian steppe were into China, or rather, into what is now northern China, because in the early 13th century China was not a unified nation but a collection of competing states, each deeply suspicious of the others, and each therefore somewhat disinclined to cooperate. Even when a very large and very angry army appeared on their northern borders, the first target was the Western Sire, a state ruled by the Tangut people in what is now northwestern China. The Western Sire sat on several important trade routes and had the considerable nerve to have previously rejected Temujin's request for military assistance during his unification campaigns. This kind of slight was something Genghis Khan wrote down in his very long, very thorough mental ledger, and the Western Shia was reminded of this in 1209 when the Mongol armies arrived. The campaign was complicated. The Western Shia had defences, they had cities, they had walls. The Mongols were still developing their siege capabilities at this point. The first campaign ended in a negotiated settlement rather than a complete conquest, which Genghis Khan accepted because he had something larger to do, and the Shia were suitably chastened. But he did not forget the unfinished business. The Jin dynasty of northern China was an altogether different and more formidable challenge. The Jin were powerful, sophisticated, wealthy, and had a long and practiced tradition of managing the Mongols through a combination of tribute, flattery, playing the tribes off against each other, and occasionally sending punitive expeditions onto the steppe to remind the nomads of their proper place in the world order. The Jin had been the ones who had paid the Tatars who poisoned Yasuge. They had been collecting a kind of cosmic debt for 30 years, and the collector had arrived. The war against the Jin began in 1211 and would not be fully resolved until after Genghis Khan's death. But its early years were catastrophic for the dynasty. Mongol cavalry swept across the North Chinese plains with a freedom of movement that the Jin armies, built around infantry and fortified positions, simply could not counter effectively in open battle. Cities fell. The Jin emperor fled south. The Jin capital, Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, held out under siege for years, but fell in 1215. The Mongol armies plundered it for a month. When they were done, the smoke from the city was said to be visible for days. Genghis Khan himself did not stay to oversee the full occupation. He took what he needed, including the single most important resource any conquering empire requires: people, scholars, administrators, engineers, architects, doctors, craftsmen. Anyone with a useful skill was sent north and incorporated into the growing Mongol system. Yelu Chukai, a brilliant Confucian scholar and administrator who had served the Jin, became one of the most important advisors in Mongol history, counseling Genghis Khan and his successors toward a governing philosophy that saved the lives of millions of people by arguing, successfully more often than not, that dead subjects paid no taxes. Yelu Chukai is worth pausing on for a moment. He was a man of extraordinary learning, deeply steeped in Chinese philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, and statecraft. When Genghis Khan first encountered him, he reportedly said something to the effect that since he had destroyed the Jin, surely Yelu Chukai must consider the Mongols his enemies. Yelu Chukai's response was remarkable. He said that his father and grandfather had served the Jin, and therefore the Jin were his country, and he could not consider them enemies. Genghis Khan, who respected directness above almost every other quality, was apparently delighted. He kept the man close for the rest of his life. This is the detail that gets lost in the simple narrative of Mongol destruction. Genghis Khan liked smart people. He listened to them. He asked them questions and expected real answers, rather than flattering ones. He was surrounded, throughout his campaigns, by advisors of staggering intellectual range, men from utterly different civilizations who had been drawn into his orbit through conquest, and stayed there through the magnetic pull of what he was building. The empire was not just cavalry charges and burning cities. It was also this constant absorption of human talent into a machine that was simultaneously destroying the old world and building a new one. Genghis Khan was not simply a destroyer. He was, in his peculiar and extraordinarily violent way, a builder. He destroyed in order to rebuild on his own terms. Chapter 9. The Merchant Princes and the Catastrophe They Caused. While the war with the Jin continued to the east, Genghis Khan turned his attention west, toward the Great Silk Road trade networks and the states that controlled them. His initial intentions were commercial, not conquest, trade. He sent a large caravan of merchants westward with goods, and a diplomatic message to the Khwarezmian Empire, a massive Islamic state stretching across modern-day Iran, Central Asia, and parts of Afghanistan. The empire was ruled by Shah Muhammad II, a man whose enormous ambition and fairly limited wisdom would kill more people than perhaps any single era of judgment in medieval history. He accused the Mongol merchants of being spies. He had them all executed, and he confiscated their goods. Genghis Khan sent an embassy to Shah Muhammad, demanding justice and the surrender of the governor who had committed the outrage. The Shah had the Mongol ambassadors killed. One was beheaded. The others had their beards shaved, a profound humiliation in the culture of the time, and were sent back. What followed is sometimes called the Mongol invasion of Khwarezm. It should probably be called something else. because what it actually was the systematic and nearly complete erasure of one of the most sophisticated and wealthy civilizations of the medieval Islamic world. The Shah Muhammad II had an empire of perhaps 5 million people, magnificent cities, flourishing scholarship, great mosques and libraries and markets. He had an army numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Genghis Khan brought somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 soldiers across the Tian Shan mountains in winter, a feat of logistics and sheer will that defied every assumption about what was possible for an invading army. He split his forces into multiple columns that descended on different parts of the empire simultaneously, preventing the Shah from concentrating his defense. Shah Muhammad, who had chosen to distribute his army across his cities rather than concentrate it in the field, found himself unable to mass enough force to stop any single Mongol column while the others were burning everything else. Otrar fell. Its governor, Inalchuk, the man who had started all this by executing the merchants, was captured and met an end that was reported to involve molten silver being poured into his eyes and ears, a proportional response by the standards of the time to a man whose greed had triggered a catastrophe. Bukhara fell. Genghis Khan rode his horse into the great mosque and declared it a stable. Whether this was symbolic insult or just practical use of a large interior space is unclear. He told the gathered people that he was the punishment of God, come for their sins, and that if they were sinless, God would not have sent him. It is one of the most chilling public statements in recorded history, delivered calmly by a man who believed it. Samarkand fell, despite its enormous garrison and tremendous fortifications. Merv fell. Nishapur fell. Urgench fell after a desperate and extended siege. City after city, each one a jewel of Islamic civilization, each one taken. The casualties were enormous. Ancient, irreplaceable cities were reduced to rubble, libraries that had preserved Greek and Roman learning and advanced Islamic scholarship for centuries were burned. Irrigation systems that had sustained agriculture for millennia were destroyed. Some regions simply never recovered. What had been fertile, populated, sophisticated heartlands of civilization became empty and remained so for generations. And Shah Muhammad II, he fled, never stopped fleeing, from city to city, province to province, always one step ahead of the Mongol pursuit teams that Genghis Khan sent specifically to chase him. He died on a small island in the Caspian Sea, a fugitive in his own empire, reportedly wrapped in another man's shirt because he had nothing left of his own. Genghis Khan had not wanted to destroy Khwarezm. He had wanted to trade with it. The Shah had made a different choice, and an entire civilization paid for it. Chapter 10. The Raid at the End of the World. While Genghis Khan was personally overseeing the campaign against Khwarezm, he detached two of his greatest generals, Jebi and Subutai, and sent them on a mission that was, by any measurement, one of the most extraordinary military expeditions in history. Their orders, approximately, were to circle around the Caspian Sea, scout the lands to the west, and come back. They did this. If by come back you mean travel 20,000 kilometers across 5 years and multiple civilizations and win almost every battle you fought along the way. Jebe and Subutai crossed into the Caucasus. They defeated the powerful Georgian kingdom in battle. They crossed the Caucasus Mountains. They encountered and defeated the Alans, a people from the North Caucasus, then the Kipchak steppe warriors. The Kipchaks fled to the Crimea and beyond, asking the princes of Kievan Rus for help. A combined Rus-Kipchak force, vastly larger than the Mongol expedition, met Jebe and Subutai at the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223. The feigned retreat worked, of course. The combined force charged. The Mongols ran. The combined force pursued with enthusiasm across the steppe for miles before the encirclement closed. The Rus Kipchak army was effectively destroyed. The Mongol generals killed several Rus princes in the aftermath. The execution of enemy commanders was conducted without bloodshed, in the honourable manner. They were placed under boards, and the Mongol generals held a celebratory feast on top of them. Then Jebe and Subutai rode home. Jebe died on the return journey, cause unknown. Subutai came back to Genghis Khan and filed his report. Europe, he noted, was interesting. The kingdoms there did not cooperate with each other particularly well. Their armies fought in a way that was well suited to being defeated by Mongol tactics. The roads and rivers and geography were favourable. There was, in his professional assessment, no military obstacle that would prevent the Mongols from going as far west as they wished. He was right. The Mongols would be back. Chapter 11. The Family, the Succession, and the Shadow of Jochi. Throughout all of this, Genghis Khan was also managing something that would ultimately prove more complicated than any foreign enemy. His family, 4 sons by Borte, Yoshi, Chagatai, Ogedei, and Tolui, each one brilliant in their own way, each one carrying, in different concentrations, the ferocity and intelligence and ambition of their father, and each one aware, in the way of princes everywhere, that their father was not immortal, and that the question of what came next was becoming urgent. Yoshi was the eldest, brilliant commander, beloved by his men, capable of extraordinary generalship. He was also, in the eyes of his brother Chagatai, potentially illegitimate. Chagatai, blunt and fierce and completely lacking in diplomatic restraint, said this out loud on at least one occasion in front of their father and the assembled court. The confrontation was ugly. Genghis Khan, who had always acknowledged Yoshi and treated him as a full son, was furious. He did not change the succession arrangement, but the wound was in the family now, and wounds in Mongol families had a way of bleeding for generations. Ogedei was eventually designated as Genghis Khan's heir, not the eldest, not the most militarily brilliant, but the most politically stable, the most capable of holding disparate groups together, the most likely to maintain what his father had built, rather than immediately starting a civil war over it. Genghis Khan was a better judge of character than most men alive, and his assessment of Ogedei proved accurate, for a time. Tolui, the youngest, was given the Mongolian homeland, in keeping with tradition. He would become the father of 2 of the most consequential men of the next generation, Kublai Khan, who would complete the conquest of China and found the UN, Dynasty, and Hulagu Khan, who would conquer Persia and establish the Ilkhanate. The empire that Genghis Khan was building would be divided among his sons and their descendants. It would become 4 great empires, each one larger than almost anything that had existed before. The division would eventually contribute to the fragmentation and decline of Mongol power, but that was for later. In the early 1220s, Genghis Khan was still alive, still conquering, and still the single most dangerous human being on the planet. Chapter 12. The Man Who Ruled the World in a Tent. Here is a detail that tends to get swallowed by the scale of everything else. Genghis Khan never lived in a palace. In the decades of his rule, when he commanded the largest empire the world had ever seen, when kings and emperors and caliphs sent him tribute and fear in equal measure, he continued to live the way he had lived as a child, in a ger, a felt tent on the open steppe. This was not false modesty. It was identity. The Mongols were nomadic people, and their identity was inseparable from their movement. To stop moving was, in some deep cultural sense, to stop being Mongol. The great encampment that travelled with the Khan, his ordo, his horde in the original sense of the word, which simply meant the royal camp, was a mobile city. thousands of people, thousands of carts, thousands of horses moving across the steppe in the way that his people had always moved. But at the center of it was a Ger, larger and grander than those of ordinary people, draped in white felt and carrying the symbols of imperial authority, but a Ger nonetheless. His daily life, even at the height of his power, retained the rhythms of the steppe. He rose early. He rode horses, an activity he continued almost until the end of his life, not for ceremony, but because he genuinely loved it. He hunted, and the great hunts organized by Mongol rulers were legendary events, vast organized drives across enormous territories where hundreds or thousands of horsemen would form a circle miles across and gradually contract it, driving every animal inside toward the center. These were as much military exercises as recreational events, training coordination, horsemanship, and the ability to hold formations over great distances. Genghis Khan participated in these hunts personally and vigorously, and the fall that may have contributed to his death happened during such a hunt. He ate meat, mutton, horse meat, dried and fresh. He drank airag, the fermented mare's milk that was the daily beverage of the steppe. He also, on occasion, drank kumis, a stronger fermented milk. His court feasts, when they happened, were legendary for their quantities of food and drink, for the entertainment of musicians and storytellers, for the presence of advisors and generals and visiting dignitaries from across the known world. But they happened around a fire or in the great tent, not in a marble hall. The contrast with the rulers he had displaced or destroyed is striking. The Jin emperor had lived in a palace of extraordinary sophistication and luxury. The Shah Muhammad of Khwarezm had court poets who composed verses to his magnificence. The Caliph of Baghdad had surrounded himself with the accumulated artistic and intellectual wealth of centuries, and the man who had swept all of them aside slept in felt. There is a philosophical argument to be made that this was actually the source of his military advantage. The Mongol army could move fast because it required no logistics train of the kind that palace-dwelling rulers depended on. The conqueror, who had never become comfortable, was impossible to make comfortable enough to slow down. Genghis Khan had spent his formative years with nothing, and the habits of mind formed in those years never left him, even when he had everything. He also maintained something throughout his life that rulers of settled civilizations often lose: direct contact with his people. The Mongolian tradition of the Kurultai, the great assembly where the Khan consulted with his commanders and chieftains, was not mere ceremony. It was genuine consultation. He listened. He argued. He changed his mind when presented with better information. The secret history records disagreements that reached the level of raised voices and genuine conflict, and records him reconsidering positions when the argument against him was strong enough. He was not a man who confused power with infallibility. He also had a genuine sense of humour. The accounts that survive are not full of it, because they were mostly written by people with serious purposes in serious contexts. But enough comes through to suggest a man who could laugh at himself and at the absurdities of the world he was remaking. He liked stories. He liked wit. He rewarded men who could make him laugh, as well as men who could make him victorious. This is Genghis Khan that the simple narrative of world-destroying conqueror does not quite capture. The man in the tent, laughing with his generals, asking Chinese scholars about the nature of heaven, drinking airag in the freezing cold on the steppe where he was born, listening to the wind and planning the next campaign. Not a monster, not a saint, something more interesting and more complicated than either. Chapter 13. The Return to the East and the Unfinished Business. After the destruction of Khwarezm, Genghis Khan returned east. He was in his 60s now. The body that had endured decades of campaigning was showing the arithmetic of a life spent on horseback in extreme cold and extreme heat, eating whatever was available, sleeping in the field, sustaining the kind of physical stress that most people would not survive a single season of. He had been thrown from a horse at some point, and the injury had never fully healed. He moved with more care than he once had. But the mind was as sharp as it had always been, and the ambition had not diminished by a single degree. The Western Shia had been waiting, the Tangut state that had first been chastened in 1209 and had subsequently, while Genghis Khan was busy burning Khwarezm, failed to provide the military support it had promised. This was the kind of failure that Genghis Khan did not allow to be permanent. In 1225, he gathered his forces and turned toward the Western Shia with the full weight of everything he had built. The campaign was the last great military endeavor of his life. The Western Shia resisted, city by city, with a stubbornness that must have impressed even as it infuriated. But the conclusion was not in doubt. The Mongol armies were by now a mature, experienced, multi-ethnic military machine, incorporating the best elements from every civilization they had encountered. The Western Shia's resistance was gallant and ultimately futile. During this campaign, Genghis Khan was hunting in 1226 when something happened. The accounts vary. His horse shied at something and he was thrown, or he was already ill, or he suffered the horse fall and it accelerated an illness that was already taking hold. Whatever the precise sequence, he was hurt. Seriously, his commanders wanted to postpone the campaign. He refused. He was dying. Probably. He knew it. He drove the campaign forward anyway. This is not a small detail. A man in his 60s, seriously ill, possibly with a broken body from a fall, on campaign in the field in northwestern China in conditions of considerable hardship, who has been told by his commanders that the campaign should wait, who simply says no, not from bravado, not because he couldn't stand the idea of showing weakness, though that may have been part of it, but because the Western Shia had failed in their obligations, and he had set out to make them account for that failure, and he was not going home until the account was settled. There is something almost incomprehensible about that kind of will. We are talking about a man who had, by this point, already conquered more of the world than anyone in history. He had nothing to prove. He had nothing left to establish. His legacy was, at this point, literally beyond human comparison. And yet, he was lying in a felt tent in the field, ill, and he would not go home. His son Tolui was with him in those final months. The secret history describes Tolui staying at his father's bedside, performing shamanic rituals, offering his own health and life in exchange for his father's recovery. Whether this is literal or metaphorical is unclear. What is clear is that the relationship between Genghis Khan and his younger son was deep and genuine, and that the end of his life was not a lonely death in isolation, but something more attended, more human than the scale of his life might suggest. Chapter 13. The Death of Genghis Khan. The exact circumstances of the death of Genghis Khan have been a subject of historical debate, speculation, and occasional creative interpretation for 800 years. What is known is that he died in August of 1227, somewhere in northwestern China, during or shortly after the final campaign against the Western Shia. He was somewhere between 60 and 65 years old. He had been ill for some time. The cause of death is genuinely unclear. The fall from the horse is widely reported. Typhoid fever is a serious possibility. A Tangut arrow is sometimes mentioned. Wound infection. Cumulative physical damage from decades of the hardest possible campaigning. A romantic legend, difficult to verify and impossible to dismiss, claims that he was fatally wounded in an intimate encounter with a captive Tangut queen with a distinctly violent disposition. That story is probably embellishment, but you will find it told with absolute conviction in various corners of the internet, and it says something about Genghis Khan's mythology that even his death is not permitted to be straightforwardly mundane. What we do know is that the men around him did not panic. They maintained order. They kept the campaign going. They communicated through the YAM system with the secrecy of professionals managing a state secret. The empire was too large, too important, too carefully constructed to be allowed to crack simply because the man at its center was dying. This itself is a kind of testimony to what he had built, an institution, not just a personal empire that would collapse with the loss of its founder, but a system deep enough to absorb even this. What happened in the days before his death, according to the secret history of the Mongols and other sources, was that he gave instructions. He called his generals and sons together and delivered a final strategic briefing on how to complete the conquest of the Jin dynasty. He had not finished. He would not finish. But someone else could. He told them how. He also asked to be buried in secret with no marker, so that no enemy could find his grave and desecrate it, and no cult could grow around his tomb. The men who buried him, the sources say, were killed by those who accompanied them, and those killers were killed in turn. The precise location of the grave of Genghis Khan has never been found. Archaeologists have searched for decades. Satellite imagery has been applied to the problem. The grave remains, as far as anyone knows, exactly where Genghis Khan intended it to remain. Hidden, inviolate, unknown. The Western Seer did not survive the campaign. Its population was decimated, its civilization effectively extinguished from the historical record. It was his last order, and it was carried out. When the army rode back north to deliver the news to the empire, they were instructed to say nothing, to let no one know, to maintain the appearance of a living Khan until the succession was secured. Ogedei was installed as Great Khan at a Kurultai, a formal assembly, in 1229, 2 years after his father's death. The most dangerous man in the history of the world died quietly, far from his homeland, in a felt tent, as he had been born. Chapter 14. The Empire after the Khan. To understand what Genghis Khan built requires looking at what it became after he was gone, because the empire he created did not die with him. It grew. It kept growing for another 50 years, reaching its maximum extent under his successors in a wave of expansion so relentless that it came within a genuine possibility of consuming all of Europe. Under Ogedei Khan, the conquest of the Jin dynasty in China was completed. Korea was subjugated. The great general Subutai led the Western campaign that swept through Russia, crushing one principality after another with bewildering speed. Kiev, one of the great cities of the medieval world, fell in 1240. Poland was invaded. Hungary was invaded. The Mongol forces rode to the Adriatic Sea. They were in position to drive into France and Germany when Ogedei Khan died in 1241, and the generals were recalled to Mongolia for the succession. Europe did not know it had been saved by the death of a man it had never heard of, in a place it couldn't find on a map. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, took his armies into the Middle East, and in 1258 took Baghdad, ending the Abbasid Caliphate that had been the center of Islamic civilization for 5 centuries. The Caliph, the spiritual and temporal leader of the Sunni Islamic world, was rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses. The House of Wisdom, one of the greatest libraries and centers of learning in the world, with its hundreds of thousands of manuscripts of Greek, Roman, Persian, and Islamic scholarship, was thrown into the Tigris River. The river ran dark with ink. Kublai Khan completed the conquest of southern China, ending the Song dynasty and founding the Yuan dynasty, making himself Emperor of China in the fullest sense. He moved his capital to the city that would eventually become Beijing. He received Marco Polo. He attempted, unsuccessfully, to invade Japan twice, with both invasion fleets destroyed by storms that the Japanese called kamikaze, divine winds. He attempted to invade Vietnam and was driven out. He attempted to invade Java. His reach was genuinely global and his failures were few. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace as historians call it, with some irony given the scale of violence required to establish it, created for roughly a century the conditions for the greatest cross-continental exchange of ideas, goods, people, diseases and technology the world had yet seen. The Silk Road operated at maximum capacity under Mongol protection. A merchant with a Mongol tablet of safe passage, a jarej, could travel from China to the Black Sea with reasonable expectation of safety. News, innovations, fashions, foods and pathogens moved freely across Eurasia. The Black Death, which would kill a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, almost certainly spread along the same Mongol-protected trade routes that were carrying silk and spices westward. The very roads and postal systems and administrative structures that Genghis Khan established made the world smaller and more connected. The world that emerged from the Mongol era was not the same world that had entered it. It was more integrated, more traumatized, more demographically reshuffled, and in ways that are still being untangled by historians, more modern. The Chinese bureaucratic model that Kublai Khan absorbed and institutionalized would influence governance across East Asia for centuries. The administrative innovations the Mongols carried westward left traces in the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal Empire that followed. The geographical knowledge accumulated through Mongol campaigns and the trade they facilitated was the foundation on which later European explorers would build their understanding of Asia. Marco Polo's accounts of his time at Kublai Khan's court were considered fantastical by many Europeans. They were the most accurate description of China that Europe would have for generations, and they fired the imagination of explorers, including, it is said, Christopher Columbus, who carried a copy of Polo's accounts on his voyage westward, looking for the wealth of the East. The Mongol Empire, in other words, is a direct ancestor of the age of exploration, the connected world that Genghis Khan forced into existence at such extraordinary cost planted the seeds of the global economy that followed. Draw a line from the burning of Bukhara to the founding of the New York Stock Exchange, and the line is not straight, but it is real. The world was integrated once, catastrophically, and then the networks remained, and trade followed them, and information followed trade, and the modern world followed information. None of this was the plan. But very few of the most consequential things in history are. Chapter 15. The Legacy of the World Conqueror. How do you assess a legacy like this? How do you measure the life of a man who, in a single lifetime, built the largest contiguous land empire in history, who reorganized the political map of the entire Eurasian continent, who caused the deaths of millions through his wars and the devastation of his conquests, and who simultaneously created the conditions for the greatest era of cross-cultural exchange the medieval world had seen? The honest answer is that you can't do it cleanly, and any attempt to do so says as much about the person making the assessment as it does about Genghis Khan himself. The death toll attributed to the Mongol conquests is staggering. Estimates range from 30 to 40 million people, though some historians have argued for much higher numbers. These are not precise figures. They cannot be. The census records of the civilizations destroyed were themselves destroyed, and the demographic impact of the Mongol conquests on regions like Persia, Central Asia and northern China is visible in the archaeological record in the form of abandoned cities and collapsed irrigation systems rather than reliable numbers. What can be said is that in some regions the population collapse was catastrophic and generational. Iran, for example, may not have recovered to pre-Mongol population levels until the 19th century. These are not abstractions. These are human lives, human cultures, human possibilities, ended. And yet, the man who caused this destruction was also the man who established religious freedom as a legal principle when the dominant civilizations of the day were burning heretics. He was the man who created a universal legal code that applied to everyone, from the lowliest soldier to the Khan's own family, at a time when every civilization on Earth operated on the principle that the powerful made the rules and the weak followed them or suffered. He promoted people of talent and ability regardless of their birth. He created infrastructure for communication and trade across a greater distance than any previous government had controlled. He brought literacy to a people who had none. He was also, in his private life, a man of genuine loyalty to those who were loyal to him. The Baljuna covenant, made with 19 men around a muddy lake, was honored. Every one of those 19 men prospered under his rule. He remembered those who had helped him when he was nothing and rewarded them. He never forgot a kindness any more than he forgot an injury. Borte remained his principal wife until the end of his life. In a world where powerful men collected wives as casually as they collected horses, where Genghis Khan himself had numerous other wives and companions, Borte kept her position as Great Khatun, the supreme consort, throughout everything. Her sons inherited the empire. Her counsel was sought throughout his life. The girl with dark eyes who had been taken from her camp and brought back, who had given Temujin his first son, and perhaps the greatest psychological wound of his early adulthood, was the woman who stood beside the universal ruler until there was no more standing left to do. The DNA of Genghis Khan has been found in approximately 8% of the men living in a broad swathe of Asia, from the Caspian to the Pacific. Roughly 16 million men alive today carry a Y chromosome signature associated with the Genghisid lineage. The ruler who conquered the world left his genetic mark on it with a thoroughness that no one before or since has matched. What does it mean to leave a mark like that? To have lived so completely, to have reached so far, to have touched so many lives in so many ways, that your biological presence echoes through centuries in the bodies of people who don't know your name. It means that in some very literal sense, Genghis Khan never ended. He became part of the population of the world. He became part of the ongoing human story in the most fundamental biological sense possible. The world he created and the world he destroyed are the same world. The trade routes he protected also carried the plague. The administrators he promoted also oversaw massacres. The peace he established was built on the foundations of wars that left entire civilizations in the historical past tense. The clarity and the horror are inseparable. They are the same man. Chapter 16. The man behind the legend strip away the conqueror. Strip away the empire and the tactics and the body counts and the centuries of mythology. What was Temujin, the boy from the Onon River, actually like? The secret history of the Mongols, written by Mongols for Mongols, not as propaganda for outsiders, but as an internal record, gives us the clearest picture. And the picture it gives is not of a monster. It is of a recognizably human being, shaped by extraordinary experiences into something extraordinary, for better and for worse. He was loyal, ferociously personally loyal to people who had earned it. The loyalty he showed to men like Gelmi, who had nursed him back from a near-fatal wound in his early career, and Bogorchu, his first sworn friend who had helped him recover stolen horses as a teenager and stayed with him through every subsequent disaster, was real and lasting. These men were given the highest positions in the empire. They ate at his table. Their advice was sought and sometimes taken. He was capable of mercy and demonstrated it in ways that surprised people who expected only destruction. Sube'etei, one of his greatest generals, was the son of a blacksmith, not a warrior lineage at all. Genghis Khan elevated him to command because he was brilliant, and because Genghis Khan genuinely did not care about your bloodline if you could do the job. This was not universal. His treatment of the Tatars, the people who had killed his father, was thorough and definitive. He remembered every injury. He settled every score. But he did not punish without reason, and he did not kill simply for the pleasure of killing. He was intensely curious. The conversations he held with Taoist monks, Islamic scholars, Buddhist monks, Christian priests are documented. He asked them about the nature of God, about the afterlife, about the principles of good, governance, about the stars. He listened. He was not a man who had decided all the answers in advance and was merely waiting for others to confirm them. He asked questions until near the end of his life. He was, by the standards of his time and culture, a devoted family man. He grieved when his son Yochi, who died shortly before him in 1227, predeceasing him by only months, was lost to him. The estrangement between father and son in the last years of Jochi's life almost certainly related to the old question of paternity, and Chaghatay's unforgivable public challenge was a wound that the secret history handles with conspicuous delicacy. The two men who should perhaps have spoken plainly to each other apparently never did. He was superstitious. He believed deeply in omens and the council of shamans. He took the shaman, Kokochu's religious authority seriously until Kokochu overstepped it by claiming heavenly authority over secular matters that Genghis Khan considered firmly within his own jurisdiction, at which point Kokochu found himself meeting an end that, by Mongolian custom, did not involve his blood touching the ground, but was nevertheless definitive. He was, in the end, a product of the world that made him, a world of violence and abandonment, of short lives and long grudges, of betrayal so routine that trust was a luxury requiring constant maintenance, a world where the only thing standing between your family and starvation was your willingness to fight for it. He had been given everything in that world, including its worst possibilities, and he had turned them into power with an efficiency that history has never seen before or since. Was he great? That depends entirely on what you mean by great. He was unquestionably one of the most consequential human beings who ever lived. His influence on the history of the world is measurable in centuries and continents. The question of whether consequence equals greatness is one that Genghis Khan himself, with his habit of asking questions that cut to the core of things, might have found interesting. One thing that tends to get overlooked in popular accounts of Genghis Khan is just how long a shadow his personal example cast over those who served him. The generals he trained became some of the most capable military commanders in the history of warfare. Sube'etei, who had started as the son of a blacksmith, became a man who won more than 65 battles in his career without a single major defeat, who commanded forces across distances of thousands of miles, who adapted his tactics to every terrain from the frozen Russian steppe to the plains of Hungary to the mountains of Persia. He learned from Genghis Khan, and the things he learned were not just tactical. They were a way of thinking about war and empire and the relationship between the two. Yelme and Jebe and Mukhali and the others who rose through the Mongol system to command its armies were not merely products of a training regime. They were products of a philosophy. The philosophy that ability was the only legitimate qualification, that loyalty was absolute but had to be earned and maintained, that information was as powerful as weapons, That speed and surprise and psychological pressure were force multipliers more powerful than numbers. That the goal was not to fight battles but to win them before they started, and to win wars before the fighting began. Genghis Khan taught them all of this. He taught it not in formal settings, but by doing it, by showing them what it looked like when it worked, and by holding them accountable to the same standards he held himself to. He was not a general who watched from behind. He was present. He was seen, and his presence was its own kind of instruction. Chapter 17. The Mythology and the Reality. Genghis Khan has been reimagined by every culture that has encountered his story, and every culture has made him into something different. In Mongolia, he is the national hero, a founding father, a symbol of Mongolian identity and achievement, a man whose face appears on currency and whose name graces airports and vodka, brands, and the National Wrestling Federation. In Mongolia, he is simply Genghis, and to speak of him with anything less than respect is to commit something close to cultural sacrilege. The reverence in Mongolia is not simply nationalistic pride, though it is certainly that. It is something deeper. For a people who were, for much of the 20th century under Soviet influence, discouraged from celebrating their greatest historical figure, the freedom to honor Genghis Khan that came after 1990 was not merely political. It was the recovery of identity. He is not just a historical figure to Mongolians. He is the answer to the question of who they are. A people who emerged from the grasslands and shook the world. A people whose descendants number in the hundreds of millions. A small country whose ancestor built the largest empire in history. That is not a fact you forget. In China, the historical assessment is more complicated. The Mongol conquest of China was catastrophic, and the Yuan dynasty that Kublai Khan established, whatever its contributions, was experienced by the Chinese population as foreign occupation. And yet Kublai Khan is also counted among the emperors of China, and Genghis Khan is his grandfather, and the question of how to hold all of that simultaneously is one that Chinese historiography has been wrestling with for 800 years. In the Islamic world, the Mongol conquests, particularly the fall of Baghdad and the end of the Abbasid Caliphate, are remembered as civilizational trauma. The House of Wisdom, the intellectual center of the medieval Islamic world, destroyed. Cities that had stood for centuries gone. The wounds are old, but not forgotten. There is a tradition in some parts of the Islamic world of referring to the Mongol invasions as a kind of natural catastrophe, like a flood or an earthquake, something so overwhelming and so sudden that human agency barely explains it. This is, in a way, a tribute to the scale of what Genghis Khan built. His armies were so far outside the normal parameters of military threat that contemporaries reached for supernatural explanations. In Europe, his shadow arrived before his armies did, in the form of terrifying rumours that proved, when the armies finally appeared, to have been understatements. The Mongol invasion of Poland and Hungary in 1241 left European chroniclers grasping for language adequate to describe what had happened. They called the Mongols Tartars, conflating the name Tatar with Tartarus, the Greek name for hell. They described them as demons, as divine punishment, as the people of Gog and Magog from the Book of Revelation. Pope Innocent IV wrote letters to the great Khan asking for the attacks to stop, and received in response a letter from Guyuk Khan, Genghis's grandson, that is one of the more extraordinary documents in diplomatic history. It told the Pope, essentially, to come in person and submit, and asked what authority the Pope thought he had to tell the representative of the eternal blue sky what to do. The letter was delivered. The Pope did not come in person. The Mongols did not invade further west, but not because of any diplomatic resolution. They were simply done with Europe for the moment. In the West, Genghis Khan has mostly been a figure of pure terror, a shorthand for unstoppable barbarian violence, the thing you invoked when you wanted to convey the absolute worst that could descend on civilization from outside. The image of the Mongol horde as mindless destruction has been so pervasive for so long that correcting it requires almost more effort than simply pointing to the historical record and inviting people to read it. Because the historical record shows something much more interesting than a barbarian warlord. It shows a strategic genius of the First Order, a political innovator who created institutions and policies that were, by the standards of the 13th century, genuinely progressive, a man who rose from nothing to everything through a combination of intelligence, will, charisma, ruthlessness, and the extraordinary capacity to learn from every experience, including the ones that nearly destroyed him. He was born with nothing. He was abandoned, enslaved, and left to die more than once. He rebuilt himself every time, and each time he rebuilt, he came back larger and harder and more capable than before. There is a Mongolian saying that is often attributed to him, probably apocryphally, because powerful men accumulate quotations like campfires accumulate moths. But this one captures something true about the way he lived. If you're afraid, don't do it. If you're doing it, don't be afraid. He does not appear, in any account of his life, to have been afraid. Not of the Taichagud with their wooden collar, not of the winters that nearly starved his family, not of Togrul's betrayal, not of the Shah of Khwarezm, with his hundreds of thousands of soldiers, not of the Chinese walls or the Persian fortresses or the Russian princes or the end of his own life. What is perhaps most extraordinary when you step all the way back from the individual events and the staggering statistics and the geography of conquest and the body counts is the sheer improbability of the whole thing. A child born to a minor chieftain in a felt tent on the frozen Mongolian steppe in the 12th century, abandoned by his clan, enslaved by his enemies, who builds from 19 loyal men at a muddy lake an empire that spans the world. The odds against any single step of that journey are almost incalculable. The odds against all of them are something beyond mathematics. And yet, here we are, 800 years later, talking about him, because he was afraid of nothing, and he conquered everything, and the world that we live in today, the connected, traded, mapped, politically restructured world, bears his fingerprints in ways that most of us have never noticed and never will. The boy who was born clutching. A blood clot on a freezing plain in 1162 changed the history of the world more completely than almost anyone who ever lived. He did not do it cleanly. He did not do it gently. He did not do it in ways that allow comfortable admiration. But he did it. And 800 years later, the steppe is still under that same enormous sky, and somewhere beneath it, in a place no one has found, the man who united the world lies in undisturbed silence, finally and permanently at rest. Genghis Khan, universal ruler, the man who came from nothing and took everything, born clutching blood, buried in secret, remembered forever. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, please like the video and subscribe if you haven't already. Drop a comment below telling me where you're tuning in from and who you'd like to hear about next. We have so much history left to cover. Dim the lights, the steppe is wide, and we've got a long ride ahead.